Hello and welcome to New Europe Studios. I'm speaking today with Emily Sinnot from the World Bank, who's just done a report on ageing in Europe, concentrating on the Baltic states and Central Europe. And there's some very interesting and quite disturbing findings. So you come here to talk about this report. So can you just tell us what was the report about? What were you doing it on? Why was it done?
Okay, so why this focus on Central Europe and the Baltics? So these are countries that are aging, as is all of Europe, but they're aging differently. They're aging because the younger generations are shrinking due to declines in fertility and migration, mostly to richer EU member states. And what we're not seeing is really increased lifespans. So life expectancy has not increased the way it has in the other EU countries. So this is what's different about these countries. Now, our report isn't alarmist, so we think aging in general is a good thing. So future gains in longevity are something to be celebrated. Yeah. But what we'd like to stress is that urgent action on behalf of individuals, firms, and also countries will be important now in order to maintain the huge gains from economic growth that these countries have seen in the last 2 decades. Yeah.
Now, I'm personally in favour of ageing as well, because I seem to be doing quite a lot of it. But when you say that there are these differences between, say, the wealthier economies within Europe and the ones that you're studying, could you just go through again and just tell us a little bit more about what are the factors that are involved at making these countries age less well than the rest of Europe?
Well, the premier challenge would really be on health. So firstly, it's to increase lifespan. And countries have made big gains in this regard in the last decade. So we've seen countries, for example, Estonia has gained a few years in life expectancy in the last 10 years after stagnation since the 1960s. Okay. We've also seen gains in healthy life expectancies. So that means that time in illness has kind of fallen. But really, countries need to build on these gains and make more substantial I would say progress in converging with the, better off EU member states in terms of health.
When you were mentioning the increases in life expectancy and a healthy life expectancy that we've already seen, I mean, these are vitally important. Surely the greatest of all human rights is the right to life.
Yes.
So you're saying that membership of the EU and many other factors, obviously, it has given people a longer life, or we're beginning to see that in these countries?
Well, we're certainly beginning to see in the last decade movement in a number of countries in terms of life expectancy, which really had stagnated since the 1960s. And this was really the big difference between how these economies were aging and how the better off member states had aged. Now, what's critical going forward in terms of this challenge is to reduce inequality of outcomes. So what we see is a very large inequality in health outcomes in Central Europe and the Baltics, and reducing this inequality will really be key to achieving convergence in life expectancy and better health. The second point on this is that these countries have begun to achieve the cardiovascular revolution. And what do we mean by that? We mean they've begun to reduce deaths due to heart disease. Through behavioral change on the parts of individuals, so reducing behaviors like smoking and alcohol use, also through better detection by health systems of like underlying risks, factors and treatment. But more progress has to be made in this regard, and this is key because really when we look at convergence, health should be as important as income as these economies age, because longer lifespans really should be enjoyed by people in every country in the EU.
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm sure we've all noticed that people are generally living longer, and with the European Union having say over health, a large amount of say over Europe's health, we're seeing things in like the tobacco directive is going through, and that's going to have an effect on health and presumably also an effect on saving money. Because some of these diseases cost a lot, like, as you mentioned, cardiovascular disease. Now, another thing that you mentioned, which also seems to be tied perhaps to less well-performing economies, and that's the migration from one EU country to another.
Okay, so I guess the first point I'd like to make on this is just these countries have converged in income terms for the first time really since the Industrial Revolution, when we look at historical data, as we do in this report, in the last 20 years. And they've had very high growth performance in the last 10 years. But of course, there are important push factors there that push people to leave. There's still a huge wage differential. Now, convergence, of course, will change the situation. And we've seen a number of countries, for example, Ireland in the EU, where this has reversed. You know, a country that lost people for many years and now has gained people. So moving ahead, it's hard to predict what will happen, but one can imagine that with increased income convergence, migration flows may change. But it's important to take advantage of the positive aspects of migration.
Absolutely.
Be that remittances, that money that's sent back to these countries, know-how and knowledge. Many of these countries that we are dealing with in this report are quite small. So it can be important to go abroad, get experience, gain know-how, and bring back investment and ideas to your own country. So making the most out of your diaspora is incredibly important. And these countries have, you know, large a basis of people that they can build upon in various EU countries. So really this can be a positive.
Yes, certainly. I mean, in my life, I've lived in African countries and European countries, and it's been an experience that has enriched me personally in my own life. So there are many positives to migration, and the economic ones that perhaps at the end of the day, not the most important. It's good that people move around. This is one of the things that we're trying to do. But we need to find a way of doing it that's not impoverishing the whole nation.
I mean, what we do have seen in recent experiences, for example, in Poland, we've seen people moving back and opening businesses, making the most use out of their time abroad, be that in terms of the cash they've managed to build up to invest, or just the work experience. So I think this is, you know, we see varying experience amongst these countries, and it's important not just to have one gloomy story relative to migration. The exchange of ideas amongst populations in Europe is, after all, one of the big advantages of the Union.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's very good that there's a good, strong, positive case for migration to be made, and this report does understand that. You're also talking, as you mentioned before, about life expectancy. And there's a third aspect comes in, which is very rarely discussed, and that is fertility. Yeah. Could you just explain how fertility rates fit in with what you're looking at?
Well, so aging in these countries has really been explained a lot by shrinking younger generations. And a huge factor in this has been the rapid decline in fertility that we've seen since the early 90s. Many countries moved to women having 1.3 children from 1.8 or 2 in the early 1990s. And what does this imply? This implies a very large decrease in 35% in each generation. So this is really a big factor in aging in these countries. Of course, in general, we're uncomfortable with talking about fertility and pushing people to have bigger families than they want. But what we find in our report, looking at the evidence, is actually people want bigger families than they're having. So most people say they want 2 children, but those 2 children are not appearing when we look at the numbers. So we look at why this is. Now, for these countries in Central Europe and the Baltics, what we find is that most women are having the first child. So it's the subsequent child that's the issue, and the decision to have the subsequent child seems to be blocked. There seems to be some obstacle there. So we look at various factors and try to see what's important. Now, for these countries, what is important is just the general economic situation of families. So improving the situation of families through tax and benefit systems, through providing childcare, can help compensate for the added cost of having a child. But what we find for all countries, and in particular actually for the richer EU countries, a number of whom, for example, Germany, have very low fertility rates, is that actually what's important is to reconcile work and family life. It's the reintegration of women into the workplace after having the first child. If that's difficult, it seems people may not expand their families further.
when we're talking about it, and part of the reason it is so difficult, I think, is that your own family, your own dreams and hopes of having children is so intimate that it's a very difficult area for many of us to do, either because we're embarrassed or quite simply because we don't want to cause offence. And then, of course, there is one issue which nobody talks about, which is the dropping in male fertility as well. So when we're looking at these problems, it does seem to be that if we can get a more sustainable economic future for Europe, it will then be easier to deal with these problems. Is that the case, or is that just too simple?
Well, what we find actually is it's stable employment of both the man and the woman. That is is key to the decision to have the second child and the third child in some cases. In general, having a stable economic future is important for people in deciding to take on, what is a big responsibility and a big burden. For this report, we look at detailed survey evidence over time, both which asks people how many children they want and actually looks at behaviour and determinants of that behaviour in terms of increasing family size. And I think it's very important to look at these obstacles, because if people say they want 2 children, and many countries are actually putting policies in place to encourage family size to increase.
So with the European Union going all out for jobs and growth, these matters become very, very key. And you're looking at policies that can help alleviate this situation and bring a fairer, more equal growth throughout Europe. So we're looking at things on the European level and national level, and of course there's policy at the global level as well. So how do these all match together? What are you looking for, say, from national governments? Okay,
so firstly we'd say that ageing is of course the concern of the governments, but also firms and individuals will have to step up. So I can go through briefly the implications for growth and welfare that we cover in our report. Often when people talk about ageing, and we have this rather Malthusian idea of how this is going to impact on growth, what they're really focusing on are 3 things. Firstly, that the working age population is really going to decline, and you're going to have a huge amount of retirees being supported by less and less people working. So we look at this issue, and what we find is that you shouldn't really focus just on chronological age, but rather you should focus on who's actually working. So we look at the ratios of the inactive to active in the population, and we find that there's actually a lot of room to increase activity, not even above 65, but in many countries there are large groups of people, particularly women, particularly those over 45, particularly youths, who are currently not working. And just by actually using these people in your economy, you can keep these dependency ratios pretty stable over time. So what we find is that by increasing female participation towards male participation rates, a big policy challenge of course, and bringing people into the workforce from 45 onwards, making sure that people aren't leaving and that they keep working, dependency ratios can actually stay pretty stable up to 2030 and not reduce that much afterwards. If this doesn't happen, of course, you are going to have huge increases in dependency of large amounts of older people and, of course, working age people who aren't working, relying on those who are actually in the labour force. So that's our first. The second issue is investment and savings. So there's this idea that as people age, they're going to use all their savings, and there'll be less money for investment in the economy, and this will be a drag on growth. So interestingly, what we find is that there's actually very little savings or very little wealth in the hands of the 50+ population in these countries due to economic history, due to low wages throughout their lives. Now this is changing. The younger generations are saving more and are better off, and this is what's different from the wealthier EU countries, where you often find the opposite scenario. So these normal predictions don't necessarily hold here, But of course, what will be very important, given the huge investment needs of these economies, is that savings increase and that individuals, of course, prepare for longer lives, and also that governments provide incentives, and that the financial system also deepens and provides rates of returns that will be needed to encourage saving. The third issue that we often come across when we talk about aging is, okay, there's going to be huge fiscal costs. How on earth is a country going to face this huge burden of pensions, healthcare, long-term care? So we look at each of these aspects. Now, in terms of pensions, many of the Central European and Baltic countries are small spenders at the moment relative to other EU countries. Not globally speaking, but relative to other EU countries. But key choices will have to be made, key trade-offs. There, what we're seeing is that because of many reforms in the pension system, and due to the fact that many people are earning low wages and not making very large contributions to social security systems, and presently, many people won't be covered or won't get an adequate pension in the future.
So if we were going to try and summarise, we do have an unavoidable situation looming. And we do need to make some quite bold decisions now and in the very, very near future. But if I get this right, this is not just a problem, this is also an opportunity to help reshape and make our economies and the lives of our people just a bit more better and a bit more sustainable and certainly longer and healthier. Is that?
Yes, so policy action is needed now in various areas, but of course longevity is a positive, and increasing lifespans is really the big challenge in terms of aging in Central Europe and the Baltics. That said, of course, the workforce will be getting older. And what we see is very important is that individuals and firms, and not just governments, adapt to this. And a huge challenge for firms in these countries is to adapt to their older workforce. For example, to bring in ergonomic changes, workplace practices changes, to make perhaps the transition from work to retirement more flexible, in order to keep people productive and in the workplace for longer. Additionally, a huge problem will be, and a concern will be going forward, that people aren't making the most of their older workers. There's the evidence of a bias against hiring older workers, and given that we're going to see almost a third of the workforce over 50 by 2030, this will be a huge challenge to overcome, and ones for the firm really to combat.
But also, I mean, sorry. So, okay, I'm just going to wrap this up now, sorry. So, so there are tremendous opportunities as well for us. So what the message of this report is actually is quite hopeful that there is a better future for us if we can just see this problem and do what needs to be done. And there doesn't seem to be too much controversy about what needs to be done. There's just getting the momentum and the will within businesses, which we probably haven't talked about enough on this, but also within governments and at the European level. Yes,
I mean, as we show in this report, aging is not necessarily going to be bad for these countries. They can grow and there can be continued shared prosperity, but of course urgent action is needed in some areas. I mean, in particular, in labour force participation, there's a big challenge to increase that at all ages. Secondly, on the fiscal side, countries need to prepare their pensions, long-term care and health systems for an aging population. Thirdly, it's going to be very important for firms and individuals to make the most out of having an older workforce. Individuals need to work longer and participate. In many countries, they're not even participating till the retirement age, and firms need to make better use of these older workers. So yes, there is an opportunity, and longer lives are of course a good thing. But in order to make sure that countries make the most of this, urgent kind of an early action would be required.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming in and talking about this this report, because these are issues that do affect us all, but aren't really being given the prominence on the political agendas that they need to do. So let's hope that people do read this report, do listen to what you have to say, and help perhaps a generation after me have a long and happy life. Thank you.
Thank you very much.